The coffee shop window framed Seattle's persistent drizzle like a melancholic painting. Caleb traced the path of a raindrop with his finger, wondering why after 5 years he'd agreed to meet Zach here. The same cafe where they'd first met, where Zach had later told him it was over. The poetry of it felt too deliberate, too crafted, like Zach was trying to write their story's next chapter without asking if Caleb wanted to be a character in it anymore. The bell above the door chimed. Caleb's heart lurched as Zach stepped in, shaking raindrops from his coat. He looked different, older, of course, but there was something else. A weathered quality to his face that hadn't been there before, like he'd been carrying heavy thoughts for too long. Caleb, Zach stood beside the table, hands deep in his pockets. "Thank you for coming." Caleb gestured to the empty chair, not trusting his voice yet. He watched as Zach settled in, ordered a cappuccino from the waitress. Still his usual drink, some things hadn't changed, and finally met his eyes. "You look good," Zach said softly. "Don't." Caleb's voice came out sharper than he'd intended. "Let's not do the small talk thing. You wanted to meet." "Why?" Zach wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, more for something to do than warmth. "Sarah and I divorced 6 months ago." The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. Sarah, the woman Zach had left him for, the embodiment of what Zach had called his chance at a normal life. Caleb had never met her, had actively avoided knowing anything about her, but her existence had haunted him for years. "I'm sorry to hear that," Caleb said, the polite response Olukasatic. "But I don't see what that has to do with me." "I made a mistake," Zach said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The biggest mistake of my life. I've spent 5 years trying to convince myself I made the right choice, that I needed to try being what everyone expected me to be. But I was wrong, Caleb. So wrong." Caleb stared into his cooling coffee. He'd imagined this conversation countless times in the first year after Zach left. Had rehearsed what he'd say, how he'd react. But now that it was happening, none of those practiced responses felt right. "You know what I remember most about that day?" Caleb asked. "Not the words you used to end things. Not the reasons you gave. I remember watching you walk away and thinking about how just that morning we'd been planning our future. You'd been talking about the house we'd buy someday, the garden you wanted to plant. And in the space of one conversation, all of that became nothing but smoke." Zach flinched. "I was scared. My parents, my job, the world. Everything seemed so much simpler if I just followed the expected path. Sarah was kind and patient, and I thought I could learn to love her the way I loved you." "Did you?" Caleb asked, finally looking up. "Learn to love her?" "I cared about her. Still do, in a way. But it was never." Zach trailed off, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that made Caleb's chest ache. "It was never real. Not like what we had." The past tense hung between them like a barrier. "Had? What we had? 5 years is a long time, Zach. People change. I've changed. I know. I don't expect. I'm not asking for everything to go back to how it was. I needed you to know the truth. That leaving you wasn't about not loving you enough. It was about not loving myself enough to stand up for what we had." Caleb sat back, really looking at Zach now. The nervous energy, the way his fingers kept fidgeting with his cup, the raw honesty in his eyes. It was all so familiar it hurt. But there was something new there too. A hard-won wisdom, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. "I'm seeing someone," Caleb said quietly. "His name is Lucas. We've been together for almost 2 years. Zach's face fell, though he tried to hide it. "Are you happy?" "Yes," Caleb said, and meant it. "He's good for me. With him, I never have to wonder if I'm enough, if he's ashamed of what we are. He's out to everyone in his life and proud of it." "I'm glad," Zach said, and somehow that hurt worse than if he'd been bitter about it. "You deserve that. You always did." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain outside providing a gentle soundtrack to their shared regret. "Why did you really want to see me, Zach? What were you hoping would happen?" Zach smiled sadly. "Honestly, I don't know. To apologize, definitely. To see you again. Maybe to see if there was any chance that somewhere in your heart there might still be room for me. Not now. Not while you're with Lucas. But someday." Caleb felt tears pricking at his eyes and blinked them back. "There will always be a part of me that loves you, Zach. You were my first real love, my first everything. But loving someone and being able to trust them again, those are very different things. I understand, Zach said softly. I wouldn't trust me either. Caleb reached across the table and squeezed Zach's hand briefly before pulling back. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope you learn to be proud of who you are. But I can't be the one to help you get there. Zach nodded, wiping quickly at his eyes. Thank you for meeting me. For listening. For being you. He stood up, pulling his coat back on. Be happy, Caleb. You deserve it more than anyone I know. Caleb watched him walk away, just as he had 5 years ago. But this time, instead of feeling like his world was ending, he felt something closer to peace. The closure he hadn't known he still needed. Later that evening, as Caleb climbed the stairs to his apartment, his mind was still swimming with thoughts of Zach. Opening the door, he found Lucas reading on their living room couch, glasses perched on his nose, looking up with that warm smile that had become Caleb's anchor over the past 2 years. Hey you, Lucas said softly, setting his book aside. One look at Caleb's face told him everything. Come here. Caleb sank into the couch beside him, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I met with Zach today. Lucas wrapped an arm around Caleb's shoulders, steady and sure. He knew all about Zach, had held Caleb through nights when old memories surfaced and needed to be processed. How did that go? It was healing, actually, in a way I didn't expect. Caleb turned to look at Lucas's face, seeing nothing but love and support there. You wanted to try again? And Lucas's voice was carefully neutral, but Caleb could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. And I told him I'm happy with you, that some doors need to stay closed so better ones can open. The tension left Lucas's shoulders, and he pressed his forehead against Caleb's. I love you, he said simply. I love you too. 3 months passed, and life settled back into its rhythm. Caleb threw himself into his work at the architecture firm, while Lucas's photography business continued to grow. They were discussing moving to a bigger apartment, maybe getting a dog. The memory of that rainy day with Zach began to fade like an old photograph. Until one evening, when Caleb was leaving work late. Caleb? Zach's voice caught him off guard in the parking garage. He was standing by a column, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. Caleb's heart raced, but not in the way it used to. Now it was more like seeing a ghost, startling but not enchanting. Zach, what are you doing here? I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't. Zach took a step forward. I can't stop thinking about what you said, about being proud of who you are. I've started therapy. I came out to my parents last week. Caleb's grip tightened on his briefcase. That's good, Zach. I'm happy for you. But why are you telling me this? Because you were right. About everything. And I know you're with Lucas now, but I thought maybe we could try being friends. I miss having you in my life. Even if it can't be the way it was before. Before Caleb could respond, he heard familiar footsteps behind him. Lucas approached, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. They planned to meet for dinner after his photo shoot. Everything okay here? Lucas asked, coming to stand beside Caleb. Not possessive, not threatening, just present. Caleb felt a surge of pride and love. This was what security felt like, knowing someone would always have your back without trying to fight your battles for you. Lucas, this is Zach, Caleb said quietly. Zach, this is Lucas, my partner. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken histories. Then Lucas did something that reminded Caleb exactly why he'd fallen in love with him. He extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Zach. Caleb's told me a lot about you. Zach shook his hand, looking slightly stunned. Thank you for taking care of him better than I did. I don't take care of him, Lucas said simply. We take care of each other. Caleb watched the exchange, feeling something settle in his chest. This wasn't the awkward confrontation he might have feared. Instead, it felt like the final pieces of his past and present clicking into place. Zach, Caleb said, I think maybe we could try being friends. Eventually. But we need to set clear boundaries, and it would take time. I'd like that, Zach said softly. And I promise to respect whatever boundaries you set. He glanced between Caleb and Lucas, a sad but genuine smile touching his lips. You two seem really good together. We are, Caleb said, reaching for Lucas's hand. As they watched Zach walk away, Lucas squeezed Caleb's hand. You okay? Caleb turned to look at his partner. This wonderful man who had never once made him feel like he needed to be anything other than exactly who he was. You know what? I really am. For the first time since Zach came back into my life, I feel like everything is exactly where it should be. Even with him wanting to be friends? Even with that. Because now I know it's not about holding on to the past. It's about being secure enough in our present to not let the past threaten what we have. Lucas pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his temple. I love you, you know that? Even when you get all philosophical on me. Especially then. Caleb laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. As they walked to their car together, Caleb thought about how love sometimes works in mysterious ways. Zach coming back into his life hadn't shaken his relationship with Lucas, it had strengthened it. Because true love isn't about the absence of challenges or the ghosts of past relationships. It's about facing those challenges together, about choosing each other every day, about building something strong enough to weather any storm. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and ahead of them stretched all the possibilities of their future together. Caleb didn't need to look back anymore. He was exactly where he needed to be, with exactly who he needed to be with. And this time, there wasn't a single doubt in his mind about that.